All right, I am recording live with Mr. Adrian Courage, and he only recently published his book on Kindle, Amazon Kindle, that we had been talking about for a couple years now.
Yeah, 3 years it took me to write it.
Wow.
Yeah. Hi, Isaac, by the way.
Hey, hello. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey because every time we've been talking about it in our little, we've done at least 2 or 3 of these over the years now, and been talking, and it's like, ooh, juicy book coming out. So now it's finally here. And we are just talking for a couple minutes before we started actually recording, and I was saying I'm officially 50% of the way through. And I was going to say the reason why is because, or part of it at least, is because it starts off kind of like just a typical midlife crisis affair, no big deal for the first, I don't know, third of the first half, so whatever that would be, the first few chapters. But then things get really heavy, and the stakes are kind of interesting because it's a little bit unique in that it's somebody publishing their book about their midlife crisis while they're still going through it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So that's kind of a rare thing to actually be reading. So yeah, we talked a little bit about it, and yeah, just why don't you tell us a little bit more of the details of how that you decided to do that? How did you decide to write a book about your midlife crisis while you're still in it?
Well, that's kind of the premise of the book, that it's as it happened, warts and all kind of thing. But the first chapter really kicked it off. That was the start of my writing process, because I wrote that up pretty soon afterwards.
Right.
And it's where I meet a woman in a bar who isn't my wife.
Yeah.
So I have to negotiate that I met a really nice, warm-hearted, kind woman, nothing like my wife, who at the time we were basically estranged, living in the same house, but estranged, without wanting to face up to it.
Right.
And that's what I became manic, essentially, without knowing it, without knowing what these terms like hypomania and mania are,
right,
from the psychiatric lexicon. But I stopped sleeping. I couldn't really work. I became really active in my thoughts. I had racing thoughts all night, and still had this relationship with this other woman, and I wanted to win back my wife at the same time. And she actually helped me with that, which is also quite unique. She tried to help me win back my wife rather than getting all jealous and hysterical or whatever. So that's basically how it all started. I just started writing things down that happened, and then things got really tangled up and complicated. So I just kept on writing, but it needed a lot more editing after that point. A lot more thought needed to go into how it all fits together.
Yes.
But in the end, I generally came to the conclusion that it's best to just write it down as it happened, and my personal lived experience, as Jung would say, I think.
Right. Yeah. Right. Which is what's I think further unique about it is as that you go through, and this is why I say it, after it starts off pretty
standard.
Yeah, standard, you might say. Then it gets really heavy after a few chapters. And especially because we're sort of just going through it as you went through it, us as the reader, just kind of going through your experience. And as that you're doing that, did you find, and it kind of seems this way, but also it's something that I think I've found seems interesting to me, and it kind of goes into some of the stuff that Jordan Peterson and probably even Carl Jung talk about, which is doing this act of putting things into a coherent narrative. Um, how did that feel for you in terms of like a healing process? Because it seems like it must have helped bring about some kind of healing for you.
Well, it certainly brought some clarity to this proceedings, but I I never thought of it as a healing process, because I knew from day one that I would write a successful book, that I was writing a book. I knew from day one, and it had to be from my personal perspective, and it would turn into a book one day. I didn't know how and why, but that was my feeling, because the mania brought it out of me. Basically, the mania made me write it.
Well, so here's a thought. Actually, I wanted to get into this a little bit when I talked to Connor last time, because I was trying to do like sort of a series, maybe off and on this idea of the creative process. I'm trying to remember how I worded it, but the basic question that I meant to get into, but I didn't get to explicitly, was do we create, or does the creativity just work through us? Because it kind of seems like that's roughly what you're saying, is that you were kind of almost on some level possessed by a creative force.
Yeah, absolutely. That's like absolutely how I felt, that I knew I had to do it, and that became a burden towards the second half of the book, or in the second half of the book. I realized what a burden it was to try and write all this down, because I felt that it would have an impact on people's lives. The question whether it actually will, and whether enough people will read it, is another issue. But definitely felt at the time that, wow, this is some undertaking that I've taken on here, and not many people would actually be brave enough to write all this down. And I guess, going back to your question, I think you do need a certain amount of courage to, I didn't want to use the word courage, to write
just
this,
because it's your name, it doesn't mean you can't use it.
To write anything down, I guess, and publish it takes a lot of bravery. So I think the creative process is one thing, but then turning that into something coherent is another.
Right.
I mean, manic people often just go online and write all kinds of crap down, or just write reams and reams of stuff that is no use to anyone. But I knew from reading back my writing that it was actually good, because I also happen to know how to write. So that's what sets me apart from all the other maniacs, I guess.
The maniacs. One thing that at least you haven't really got into in the first half of the book, and our talk specifically, is your religious background. But the reason that's interesting is because you talk a lot about, at least in the first half of this book, God and religious ideas and a lot of those kind of things. But I don't know, maybe you'll get into it later, but what your personal religious background was, and your religious beliefs.
I don't have any particular background in religion, apart from what basic level school stuff. But I became interested in the stuff you're interested in, which is symbolism, archetypes, philosophy, psychology, and that really kicked me on into viewing my own mission as a kind of religious act, prophecy, or something like this, you could say.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting that's going on is, and I'm trying to figure out how to word this because it's pretty complicated, but maybe you can get into it a little bit better, is that there's levels of reality that are going on. One that we often take for granted is the biological level and the neurological level, which is a little more complex than we often realize, or it's at least not maybe as straightforward as it's usually presented, in that we have certain genetic mutations, including ones that you're talking about, bipolar disorder, mania, those kind of things, that are sometimes latent in one's neurology and personality, and they only come out at this approximate phase of life, at the middle age, especially when a person goes through a lot of stress. And so that's the biological level. On top of men being creatures of testosterone, at that time in life, we're going through a change to where we're less testosterone oriented, less all about sex oriented. And so just like women go through this change almost in the same period of life of their biological clock, men sort of do the same thing, where there's a transition going on, and that transition is biological, where there's a change in sex drive and that type of thing. So there's the biological level going on in midlife, especially for someone with certain genetic markers or mutations. And then there's also the levels of what's going on in the reality of a person's life, who's around them, what their relationships are, what their career is, and all those type of things. And those things all play out upon each other. And in this book, you sort of just take us through that. But is that how you were kind of feeling going through it? Is that there's these layers of reality going on, because you're often, it seems like you're often just being at an honest loss of words, because there's the biological level, and then there's the reality level of having to figure out your relationships and everything else. So what was it like going through those layers of reality? I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
It was very, very turbulent, because although I say later in the book that none of these events are particularly unique to me. So
Right.
so lots of people get divorced, and lots of people have affairs. I mean, much more extreme. There are much more extreme cases than mine. Yeah. But it's all about how I experienced it, because I did feel a certain degree of pity for my ex-wife. And I did feel like maybe I shouldn't be doing it, but I didn't feel guilty, so to speak. And so I did have to plow on through the events as they happened. So, and that's how I wrote them down, as they happened. So it all became intertwined. I noticed, or I like the way you said there's different layers of reality, and that's definitely the case. That I felt the writing reality, the importance of what I was writing, alongside the actual events that I had to negotiate day to day. And I definitely felt they were two very distinct things. But what became interesting was when I started to do things for the sake of the book. I started to behave in a way that I would be able to write these things down, and that became a different level of reality, where I became conscious that what I wanted to do was going to be a good story.
Yeah, because I think on some level we go through these changes in life, in particular to the case of this book, a case study, Mandula, as you call it. We go through these transitions, and oftentimes what we don't realize is happening is we're just going through changes, and then we kind of post hoc make a rationalization or a story or a narrative to go with it. Whereas it seems like what you figured out to do is to do that at the same time somehow. You're going through the biological changes and the family changes, you might say, relationship changes, some ups and downs in your career, like a typical sort of midlife crisis. And then you're like, okay, I don't know exactly what this story is or where it's going, but I'm going to figure it out as I go through it. Is that sort of how it was going?
That was exactly what happened. Yeah, that was. I was aware of the. I was aware that this was nothing special was happening to me, but at the same time, I felt that because it was unique to me, it was worth writing down. And I think that people are generally too scared to write any kind of truth down.
Yeah. Well, what's you're right. It's not unique, but at the same time, the way that it's presented it is because I don't know, there's probably billions of stories like this, but they usually go untold or
Right, exactly.
not told very clearly and coherently, especially in a true to life way, because sometimes the closest thing you might get is somebody making a very completely fictionalized version of it, just because if it's too true, then it's hard to present the narrator and or the protagonist as someone without too much bias for.
Yeah, right, of course.
So
Especially someone who's
tough.
cheating on his wife, so.
Right. Right. The infidelity issues and all the pain and all the confusion and all those things. Normally, if a person would even try to tell that story at all, it would be for the most part one of two extremes, which is I'm a horrible person, or maybe the other person or everybody else is a horrible person,
Yeah,
or I'm a victim.
yeah,
Which
right.
is the tough thing about it. Whereas this is just a very honest, straightforward version, or as straightforward as one can be in a book. But what I find interesting about that, like I said, I'm kind of getting into this interesting pursuit of what it is the creative process is. It's sort of a unique form of creativity, because you're not writing a work of fiction, and you're not writing music or doing a painting, but you have to do the creative work of making your own life story over a few years presentable.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
yeah. Well, how did you find that as a creative process? What was that like?
Well, the creative process itself was, I wrote a large quantity of the book,
Mm.
probably a majority of the book in the bath.
Oh, really?
So I would have these racing thoughts at night,
Mm-hmm.
and then I would sleep a little bit, and then I would just not know what to do with myself, and I'd get in the bath at like 7 in the morning or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and then lie there for 2 hours or whatever, and just things would come to me, and I'd write them down into my phone.
Wow.
So that was my creative process most of the time. It was mostly in the bath, on the bus, on the tram. So when I was commuting to work, I would write then, and then I wrote on Trello. Do you know Trello?
What's that? Oh,
It's a
it's like
kind
an
of
app.
project management
Okay.
app, like it's called a Kanban in Toyota or somewhere in Japan. They invented it, where they had a big wall and people could move. Each proposed event would have a card, and then it would move from proposed to do to test to. I'm not explaining it very well because it doesn't really matter, but
Yeah.
I use this program that made it very easy to move little snippets of text around between chapters.
That's
So I
good.
used
Yeah.
that, made it very, very immediate, because there was no, I would say to anyone wanting to write, is to take out or remove the barriers to, well, follow the path of least resistance. So write wherever is most convenient for you, and be able to write anytime, anywhere. At least that's what worked for me.
Right.
I guess some people have a very strict routine. If they sit down at their computer, morning coffee at 8:15, and then write from 9 till, read the papers, and then write from 9 till 12, and then take the dog out for a walk, and then whatever else, have lunch. I could never work like that, obviously, because I was hypermanic a lot of the time. But
yeah, it seems like that process is more like a person writing, whereas what I think often happens in a case like yours is it's more the case of like the creative work working through the person. So it's like you're just being used by
the muse.
You're being used by the narrative, rather than you're writing. It's like the writing is just using you. But did it have that sort of feeling as you're going through it, like you're just a pawn in the game of the writing, and you're just
it really took me over, and it really excited me. It was kind of like a intoxicating experience. We can get on to that later, like what that means to be intoxicated by yourself. Because that's kind of the second half of the story. I get into, well, I've become more and more hypermanic as the story goes on, until I end up in hospital at the very end, which I say at the start. The first line is, how did I end up in hospital? But it's still, I guess, to some readers, it would still come as a surprise, because they wouldn't, I guess they forget that, or they wouldn't take it too seriously, that this is a serious medical condition that I have.
Well, it's intriguing. The other intriguing part, that was kind of like a turning point for me, where it went from being like a typical midlife crisis story or infidelity story or whatever, is your point where, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this, but your point where, at least for a brief moment, you believed you were Jesus.
Yeah.
That's my favorite part so far. Can you say anything more about what that was like to be Jesus for a minute?
It was a train of thought that I was following.
Okay.
About women, which was on one hand, you have there's the whore and the mother, isn't there? So but I was thinking more in terms of how Christ seemed to have a good rapport with the ladies.
Okay.
And he cared very much for women, and women cared very much for him, which is not really explicitly in the Bible, but he certainly forgives the woman who was going to be stoned, and he has respect for his mother, and various other incidents he has, or times he has when he helps women, which I guess in those times was more, I don't know, not frowned upon, I guess. I don't know. I don't really know.
Okay.
And that led me to the thought that all women need to be cared for and looked after by, and that what would Jesus do? And Jesus would care for and look after women. He wouldn't ask any questions. He wouldn't be a feminist or whatever else.
Yeah.
But he would respect and look after women in his daily life. There's also the story of Mary Magdalene, washing his feet, right?
Yeah.
Which was to me a completely erotic scene. Like, I looked up videos of it, and like she's like washing his feet, like
Oh yeah, your feet. It's like
She has a
she had
foot
a foot
fetish or
fetish.
something with her hair, with
Uh,
washing it with her hair. And anyway, so at that moment, I thought like, hey, I need to be like Jesus.
mhm,
And it was this realization that it was a realization that I could love both of the women or all of the women, or that I should
mhm.
love all of the women and not make too much of a fuss about it. And then I looked in the mirror and I was looking pretty a bit bedraggled, and I had a bigger beard than I do now. And I thought that, wow, that guy's Jesus.
Yeah,
uh,
because there's a lot of interesting things about that moment. Um, one, it reminds me of, I don't know. I okay, so
it only lasted for a split second as well. It was like, okay, I'm
yeah,
Jesus,
well,
but
it's like
that I'm like Jesus, so I need to follow Jesus.
yeah.
And then it kind of dawned on me what a big task that would be,
Mhm.
what a big undertaking it was, especially as my wife wouldn't understand.
Yeah, it's like a something like a touchstone moment in your journey, and maybe on all those levels of reality at once, like we talked about a little bit ago, somewhat at the biological level, the symbolic level,
Yeah.
sort of like what you're realizing needs to happen, or your process of trying to resolve what needs to happen in your personal life. um but what it makes me think of is, when I started going down some similar rabbit holes, partly or largely related to my own midlife crisis.
Oh, you had one too. Good.
Yeah, mine. Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, I definitely had one too. Although, like to sum it up, it was like backstab with my work colleagues that I thought were some of my best friends. You know, they backstabbed me, kind of threw me under the bus. At the same time as my failing marriage, at the same time as then, as soon as I got out of that, I got into a new one that was like a huge roller coaster. And my
A
best
new
friend,
marriage,
well, not a new
new
marriage, but like a new
relationship.
girlfriend, yeah. And like my best friend died from colon cancer when he
Oh shit.
was, yeah, went all at the same time in 2018. Yeah, or that was over the course of like a year and a half period, all inclusive. And so kind of when I started going down some of my own rabbit holes, sort of in a similar response to all of that, was reading a lot of the books that we talk about here. Jordan Peterson, Carl Jung, Nietzsche, um, uh, Robert Greene, and a lot of them were about, um, like even 12 Rules for Life, and some of the others, just about uh, finding your value structures and finding your values and understanding values. Um, and so one thing that I sort of, and actually when I started all these rabbit holes, and kind of what became the Facebook group and even the podcast and everything in its
Mhm.
infancy, was how does one do that? But then, and I started sort of writing at least the outline and some sort of putting material together for a book on that subject of like recreating your values. Um, but similar to, I think, what Nietzsche and Jung, and maybe even some others like Jordan Peterson went through at different points in their life, similar to what we went through in different ways, was that when you go through that process, it seems like sort of rationalistically, it seems like that's what you're going to do. You're just going to say, okay, I had these values and now I have these that are maybe inverted or rearranged or
Yeah.
refocused, things like that. And that's sort of what happens. but the interesting thing that happened in the story with Nietzsche's Zarathustra and then Jung critiquing it, and Jordan Peterson really gets into this, is the idea that when you go through that process, you figure out all the values are roughly the same as before, but you still just had to go through that process of making them your own rather than just kind of adopting them from the culture or the heritage or whatever. And so there's like a moment that I think we go through if we go down that rabbit hole or on that process, which is sort of where I think you were at, which is like this sort of little inversion moment of like an I am Jesus moment, because and this is like what Nietzsche went through with Zarathustra, and Jung almost did, but he avoided, which is to say it's a ego inflation, because you say, I am this, I am the self, I am the all spirit or the all being, and it's okay to touch that moment, but just not get caught up in it, because if not, that can take the mania too far. Maybe that's what you do for a bit later in the book, but
definitely.
It's because otherwise you just go up and down, inflation, depression, inflation, depression, inflation, depression. I guess that's kind of what happens in bipolar disorder. But if we're conscious of it, we can take control of it rather than it just being all out of control. But did you feel that experience, or
I absolutely felt the inflation depression cycle go round and round, and I thought it was a normal process, that was how it had to be, because I read Jung and the like, that this is quite normal. What I identified with very strongly is the Jonah complex. You know that?
Tell us about it.
The Jonah complex is when, well, the story of Jonah is that he received the calling from God to go to the town of Nineveh, where they become corrupted and evil, and set things straight. And Jonah said, "No way, I can't do that. It's too much of a task for me. I can't handle it." So he boards a ship and tries to run away, but the ship is too small for the however many people on the crew.
There was a storm,
and there was a big storm that blew up, and they were going to draw lots to see who would have to be thrown overboard. And Jonah said, "No, I've betrayed God. Let me go. Let me jump off overboard." And he jumps overboard, and he gets, miracle of miracles, swallowed by a great fish, a whale. And there he stays there for 3 nights, or 3 days and 3 nights, which is always how I felt it to be, 3 days and 3 nights
in the belly of the whale.
In the belly of the whale, in the misery, in the darkness. And then he gathers his strength, and at that point he gets spat out by the whale and lands on the beach. And at that point he knows that he can do God's calling, because he has no option but to do it. And I felt this multiple occasions with stuff, especially later on in the book. Do I want to put it in? Can I put it in? This would send me into a depression, and I didn't always know what it was that I didn't want to put in. I didn't always know which aspects or which paragraphs or which. And then 3 days in, I would suddenly get a burst of energy and start writing it down. And then it seemed natural that it should be there, because I kind of admitted it to myself, and I was ready to publish it to the world. And at that point, it became a blessing rather than a curse. So that was how I experienced the bipolar nature of life.
It'd be like a down for about 3 days, and then at some point you'd sort of get vomited back up and have a sense of almost miraculous empowerment to do your task.
Right, exactly.
And then you'd sort of give into that or follow that.
Right, exactly. But I would have no idea what it was that I had to do for 3 days. And then suddenly I would have, so I'd listen to a lot of podcasts or spend a lot of time online or whatever. And then suddenly I would just snap out of it and start writing. And it would be something that was really obvious, except I didn't want to write it down.
It's sort of like facing your fear.
Exactly.
You just didn't want to do it, and then once you did, it became clear. What do you say?
Exactly. But I wasn't always aware of my fear and what it was, which made it an interesting process.
Well,
because it was all psychological.
Right, because the interesting thing about that kind of fear, we have sort of internalized throughout our evolutionary process to where we're at now. We don't live in a physical threatening environment anymore where there's like lions and tigers and bears to attack us. Instead, we imagine those in the complex system that we live in, which is rather than something physically devouring us, it's like is a truth or is a word or is an idea or a relationship or people have a certain opinion of me. Is that going to destroy me? And those are like our fears in the modern world, but the way that we don't have courage to face them is we deny them. And then when we face them, we realize that they were more imaginary than reality. But what was that process like of overcoming these fears for you?
Overcoming the fear of writing or the fear in general of life?
Well, like you're talking about a minute ago, where you would have certain fears that you didn't want to face or you didn't want to put into writing, and then you realize by the time that you actually decided to do so, maybe after a period of 3 days or so, then you would realize, oh, that was just something that I was being afraid of, but I overcome it just by going through it.
Right. Yeah.
What was that like?
It was really, really intense. I mean, I didn't take the depression too seriously because I knew that was to be expected. That was kind of part of the writer's craft, is to be, or certainly for me, was to be depressed. Not depressed, but just down, I guess, or slow, sluggish. And I'd still be able to take on information on board. I'd still be able to listen to Jordan Peterson or whatever, but I wouldn't be able to actually write. But I didn't let that frustrate me too much. And then when I did come out of it, I would be so excited by my what I've written that I want to tell everyone. I would,
the good news.
The good news, I would want to tell everyone, and I would become really excited by it. And then that was the problem, and I went over the top with that, and I needed to self-medicate myself with beer and stuff like this during the day. I drank a lot of beer during the day.
Well, what I guess is a little different. So like normally, if a person decides they're going to write a book, they're able to, for the most part, kind of put together the whole idea, maybe outline beforehand. But it seems like you were kind of putting it together as you went, because you weren't exactly sure where it was going, and if you were figuring out the purpose as you went, or what was that like in terms of figuring out exactly where you wanted to go with it and what you wanted to do with it?
I kind of knew where I was going, but what would happen was something new would pop up all the time. So I was being not delayed, but I was, the finishing line seemed to keep getting further away rather than closer the more I worked on it.
Right.
And then I did feel like it was nearly finished, but I didn't have a big moment to finish it on, some kind of spectacular denouement. And like my editor was asking, like, where's this going? What are you doing with this? And I said, I don't. I wanted to thank my father as the end of the book.
Mm.
But then I ended up in hospital, and that was what gave it the final. I was lying in the hospital bed thinking, like, what am I going to do now? And I thought, oh well, this is the perfect end to the story.
going to the mental hospital. It's the perfect ending.
Exactly.
That's where every
Exactly.
good book
So
should
it's
end.
really, I guess, a unique story in that sense as well, that I wrote it while being manic and depressed, I guess, because bipolar is, this used to be called manic depressive disorder.
Because like when I was talking to Connor, and I've talked to some others recently about the creative process, and this is what kind of comes to mind with the last thing you said, is sometimes the hardest thing is to decide a project is finished.
Yeah.
But is that all that did it for you? Is like, oh, I've checked into the mental hospital, so this is going to be a good way to end it, or how did you decide how you're going to wrap it up, and what would be the ending other than the editing?
That's literally what happened, because beforehand I had no idea I was bipolar.
Wow. Okay, wow.
Bipolar. I understood that I became manic, but I felt that it was all the Jonah complex, that I was experiencing something quite normal. Even though I could cry twice a day and have real bursts of massive energy.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah. But I never thought of it as an illness. I always thought of it as part of the creative process.
Yeah. And that's, I think, what's really interesting is you're going through it, and you're kind of like taking us through the journey as you went through it. And what's tough is as it's becoming somewhat obvious to other people and you're somewhat oblivious to it. Like you're there. I think there was a point when, and this is maybe what was interesting about the Jesus moment, because that's when your wife's kind of like, oh, you thought you're Jesus? Let's talk right. Now we really need to talk to a mental health professional.
Psychiatrist.
Yeah, let's go and do that. And then you went and first talked to I think what do you call that? A therapist who recommended you to a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
Because they're realizing it's probably more serious than just the typical life transition.
Yeah, well, I was manic. I went into the appointment and I was manic and talking a mile a minute.
Yeah.
And then he said, I expected him to be like, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying, and that's very wise and everything like this. And he was like, you need to see a psychiatrist.
It's like,
and he said,
get away
from me.
A
psychiatrist. And my wife was delighted to hear this. So that upset me too.
And I don't know, this for me is kind of interesting. Well, I don't know what it is. It's because you, the two of you and your wife, are trying to figure things out in your marriage and your family. And it seems, up until at least about that point, it seems like just the typical go through that process kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And before I publish this, I'll probably say there's some spoilers in here, but not too much, especially for this one, since I've only even gotten through about half the book myself. But it's fine. Actually, I think it's helpful to give people that sort of things to long for in the story. But so it seems like she's just kind of going through the normal life stuff, I guess, But
Yeah.
then, well, and what's tough about it is if people are going to work out their marriage, and many do, what it takes is both people involved, both people in the couple need to have a unified mission to fix it. And the
Right.
more that they do, the more successful they are, but the more that they don't, the less successful that they are. And it seemed like she didn't really want to do so. But what's interesting about that point in the story is then it's almost like she could scapegoat mental health, or it's like, okay, it's not my fault, it's not his fault, we got a mental health problem here. So
Right, exactly.
then
She
she
was
could kind of
always
just
about
throw it.
mediating
Yeah.
with professional, mediating with a psychologist, psychotherapist, mediating with or not mediating, that was more than mediating, referring me to a psychiatrist, and all that was her attempts to kick the can down the road, essentially.
Right. To not
not face up to her side of the story.
Well, yeah, or her side of the story, or just the whole thing, because the whole fixing a relationship, whether it's a friendship or a business relationship or a marriage, boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, it's both people face the whole mess that's involved. But then if you don't want to do that, then you're always looking for a scapegoat, whether it's money or mental health or whatever.
Right.
And then it seemed like, oh, you thought you're Jesus, okay, mental health problem, let's go see a psychiatrist. And then you come into him manic, and he's like, okay, let's send you to another person. And then they get you well, I won't, I guess, give too much more information, but they do some helpful things. And well, I don't know if you made this clear in the book, because it happened, like, I don't know, in that sort of second quarter of the book. Is what was the point in which you decided you need to make this into the story that it became? What was that point of realization for you?
Well, it was a midlife crisis story
Mm.
from the very start, and then I guess I found Facebook groups like the Daily Archetype and a
Jung's
few
Creative
others,
Bridge and
Jung's Creative Bridge and stuff, and I saw
Yeah.
how many people are struggling with these things.
Right.
And a big one for me, which is just where you're getting to, I think, is where I discover the shadow, owning your own shadow, the book. And then I became really obsessed with that for a while. Where did you get up to again?
The point where you first used the term Tyler Durden and the narrator, chapter 27.
Yeah, that's around
50%.
around the point where I've become obsessed with not just telling
stuff.
my own story, but so revealing the underbelly of psychology, the dark side of the shadow. And I started to write a lot about that on Facebook and various groups, and also my own notes. And that became very difficult at that point to fit it into the coherent narrative I was trying to struggle with. I wanted the book to be a first-person account without too many like philosophical digressions, but you'll see later on there are some.
Yeah, philosophical digressions are good.
So I wanted to at that point have an impact on people's lives. That was the turning point, really. That at first I just wrote it, and I realized I wrote the first 3 chapters, and then people got really enthusiastic about that, and especially women, got turned on and excited by the
girls into their erotic novels.
Exactly, they got excited by it. So I thought, well, this is a format that works, telling my own story through my own writing style. then obviously I didn't want to stray too far away from that, but I ended up wanting to expose the shadow. And actually I exposed the reader's shadow by the reader wanting to read more. Yeah, that's a meta aspect as well, because the reader, if the reader gets sucked in, you suck them into your shadow, and they become kind of
intertwined.
complicit.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, we're complicit on this journey. But what was the moment that you realized, or the moment or the reason or how it came about where you're like, I definitely want to make this into a narrative? Because I think you touched on that a little bit in the book, but you didn't. I don't know if that was like really clear, but I'm wondering how did that come about where you're like, I definitely need to make this into a narrative?
Because I knew that was what would work with the readers. I knew that the readers would be seduced. I think I explained that later. The readers would be seduced by my writing, and I knew that that could only happen if I wrote it firsthand. And that's absolutely true, because they have been, readers have read it in 2 days sometimes. They sit down and they don't get up until they've read it.
Really?
So yeah, people get really carried away with it.
Interesting.
Often they don't give me any feedback either. When they finish, they don't write to me and go, your book's great. And
well, I think you got 5 5-star reviews I just saw on Kindle.
Yeah,
so that's something.
Yeah, I think you need to leave a review. You have to leave a review. You just can't just put a star there. You have to write something.
Oh yeah. There's been, I think, 5 of them already. It's only been out for like about a month now.
Yeah.
So that's something. Oh, but you were saying that before, that it's like, when it was still just a draft, it was hard you would give it to people and they wouldn't give you feedback. And I guess that's still been the case. They'll
pretty
give you
much
little or no feedback.
Yeah, they feel a bit guilty about reading it. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's that it's maybe the shadow part of them that gets into it, and so they don't, just like there are times that you had trouble verbalizing what you wanted to or putting it into words. People are maybe the same way. Do you think that's what's going on?
Yeah, I think the more psychologically unstable people are less likely to read it and enjoy it. People who've been through a few things will find it interesting or find it engaging.
Yeah.
Whereas people who haven't read it or haven't had experiences similar ilk will definitely find it hard going. Because they have to come to terms with what they would do in that situation, and they don't know, so they struggle with that.
Yeah, that's the struggle. I mean, mine was, like I said, it started off kind of very typical midlife stuff, but then it got really heavy. And then I guess what's interesting or different is, normally in a fiction type story like this would normally be, like there's part of you that might almost be thinking, well, why didn't the writer do it this way or this way or this way with the character? Whereas since in this case, this is roughly what actually happened. So it's not like that liberty was there. It's just kind of how a person really went through it. And I think that can kind of make it, I don't know, it's like a little more heavy for people,
Well,
because,
I think it's actually really difficult to do. People can feel that. It's like it's no coincidence that most books are written in the third person,
right,
or from a bird's eye view, or through the characters, rather than the character being the main protagonist being the author himself.
right.
Especially going through this kind of stuff, because you get lots of sports memoirs and other kinds of memoirs that don't you know. And then I punted a field goal or whatever, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Well,
it's very
yeah.
difficult to write from your own perspective because you have to be completely true to yourself.
Yeah, and that's the difficult part, because even in our day-to-day lives, we present ourselves and the world with sort of a persona, and which is it's like a meta version of ourselves, maybe.
Yeah,
And to
a
present
mask.
that, is sort of an honest undertaking and sort of not. And the difficult thing about it is that we don't exactly know where the truth and the fiction, or the mask and the real person are.
Well, what's interesting for me
Mm.
is that since I wrote it and since it's been published, I've been gradually, it's fading from memory. I can't remember all the chapters. I can't
Yeah.
remember, you know, as you would in your real life. When you're in the middle of it, then you're,
Mm.
you're experiencing it firsthand and really going through everything. But after a while, those memories fade and they become less immediate. So I'll have to reread the book at some stage and relive it, basically.
Maybe when you're gonna do the sequel.
Oh God, people talk about a sequel. I'm like,
The
oh,
sequel.
please don't put me through that.
The Mandala case study part 2. How was it that you decided to do? I'm just a little bit intrigued by it.
It's
And
actually a case history because
okay, yeah,
that's what
case
you would
history.
call a medical
Mm,
case history, like a
interesting.
psychiatric case history. So I've left enough breadcrumbs for people to follow and work it out, but I don't think most people would.
What about why you decided to call it Mandula, and spelled the way that it is?
Well, Mandula means almond in Hungarian. And that is also means Mandorla is the mandorla. If you come across the mandorla, means almond in Italian. And it's the shape of it's a shape created where two circles intersect. Piscis Veskis, I don't know how you say it. Anyway, it's the meeting point between heaven and earth where two circles, like the MasterCard logo. Unfortunately, MasterCard have co-opted
Oh,
it.
okay.
That's called the mandorla because it's an almond shape. And you
Interesting.
often in iconography you see Christ would appear in the mandorla, or
Right.
the Virgin Mary.
Mm,
That's like or other icons would appear in this mandorla, which is the meeting point of heaven and earth. But it can be the meeting point of light and dark, or whatever else.
right, because at first I thought it was Mandala,
Yeah.
which is similar, but at the same time quite different.
A friend of mine was reviewing it recently and said the meeting between truth and fiction.
Interesting.
So reality and my own reality, or unreality, I don't know. So that's what it meant to him.
Oh, so you're leaving it up to interpretation.
No, I explain it later in the book.
Okay.
Because I had a big realization about duality of existence, this and that and this, yin and yang, and
the
all this
physical
kind
and
of
the
stuff.
spiritual, or the
Well, everything has its own opposite, right? Everything
right.
has its own opposite that it needs to reconcile, because both are valid positions.
Well, right, and that's the source of what we would call something like mental energy, or psychic energy, or libidinous energy, not necessarily sexual, but the interplay of the opposites. And it sounds like that's what you're working through here,
Exactly.
especially with taking us through the journey of becoming and realizing your bipolar disorder.
I came across bipolar disorder is obviously an example. The Mandula, I came across it in Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert A.
Green or Johnson?
Johnson. Yeah, sorry, Johnson. He has a chapter at the end where he talks about the mandala in that book, Owning Your Own Shadow.
Okay.
Which seems really incongruous at the end of that book.
Right. Because that's the interesting thing that not, and I think this is where we're at maybe in our what would you call it, our history as a culture or civilization is figuring out how to have that unity of opposites.
Right. Yeah.
That's sort of like where we're going, and again, like, you know, I mentioned this a bunch of times in these recordings, is that I'm not exactly into astrology, but there's one interesting point that Jung talks a lot about, which is that we have been in the Piscean age, we're going into the Aquarian age.
Right.
And
Yes.
what that is that in the Piscean age was basically it's similar to that yin yang idea, which it was the sort of tension or war of opposite forces, whereas the Aquarian age is a
Represented by Christ, right?
well, right, yeah, Christ, well,
Christ on the cross.
yeah, and it also is represented by um the Christ symbolism of fish, and also that when there's two fish, like in the Piscean age, it represents Christ and Antichrist, or Christ and opposite, or perfect and the opposite contender, whereas the Aquarian age is the unity of opposites, sort of the what they call an alchemy, what's the word,
Conjunction.
yeah,
Conjunctio.
yes, that's
Conjunctio.
a tough word to say. It's like a Latin word, I think, which is exactly that. It's sort of the culmination of opposites, or the coming together of them. And anyway, so that's what I think is interesting about this book at this time, is that's, I think, where we're at in our sort of history and myth as a culture, is figuring out how to have an integrated shadow.
Yes.
Which is sort of this point that you're getting at with the mandula.
Exactly. Yeah, I did feel at the time that it was of its time, the book, because people were still stuck in the shadow.
Right.
And we've, as a society, we've become so advanced that we don't really need to worry about very much. Like, you know, when the pandemic came along, people lost their jobs, and it didn't seem to matter to anyone. You know, that everyone was just saying how terrible it was, but they were quite happy to just sit at home and work from home, and, you know,
complain about the world on the internet all day.
Spend all day complaining about the world without actually going outside into it. And that was that was kind of my feeling of the
like, yeah,
pandemic.
What's interesting about shadow integration is it's an awareness of it, and coming to terms with it, and then having to go through the process of integrating it. Whereas most people, what they do is they realize that there's shadow elements going on, but they don't ever want to deal with it. So instead of dealing with it, they project it out onto the world, like you're talking about there. You know, people just
Right.
going on the internet and
what I wanted to say is now people can afford to address their shadow, because they have enough material comfort to be able to sit down with themselves and have a serious, like, discussion with themselves about the meaning of life and what they want to do when people were so poor they were living hand to mouth, or season to season, they couldn't afford to, the average person couldn't afford to work on their shadow, because survival was everything and the family was everything, and that was all very natural, that the survival and the family and the wider culture and being part of that was kind of the purpose of life. That was obvious. And now we kind of cut adrift as individuals. We each have to work out our own way how to be in the world as individuals, rather than as how to, make ends meet or whatever. People could leave their jobs and do something they love to do. That would be possible to pull off now, whereas in previous eons, previous ages, you needed a strong religious structure, of Christian structure, to keep the world together, and now that's been just jettisoned kind of,
right,
by society at large, and there's nothing to replace it. Whereas I think what will replace it will be the power of the individual to make a difference, to influence society in a much bigger way.
See, yeah, this is kind of getting at the issue that I was talking about a while ago, which is, okay, in past eons, you could call it the Piscean age, or the past couple thousand years at least, roughly, is people would just project out those things, their shadow, everything, onto religious narratives for the most part. And so they would say, oh, there's evil in the world, or evil in myself, evil in my brother, my wife, whoever, that must be the devil in them. And it's complicated. There may be some truth there. Those are complex things. And so now in the 20th century and up to this point in the postmodern world that we're now in, we've gone from being able to project it out on just narrative structures like the Christian narrative, or even the other major religions, East and West and everything, from just being able to project it onto them, to where we have been, for at least the last 100 years or so, projecting it onto societal models of communism, fascism,
government state.
Yeah. And but now you're right, it is just that we have the material means and the time on our hands to not just need to project these things out, but actually take some time to
take ownership.
Take agency of our own projections and our agency of our own shadow material, and try to integrate that.
This was the meta idea that I wanted to get through to readers, that I am me and I have to take responsibility for that, and that's
right.
That's a tough gig, but I think all people need to go through that.
Right.
The fact that I ended up in a mental institution kind of casts doubt on my suggestions, but certainly I produced a work of value.
Right. I think it just makes the work more
nuanced.
Well, and more serious, because if it's not for that, and it was just like, I was going through a midlife crisis and here you go. Well, partly because there's a lot of people who have that, even the bipolar mutation, and or just genetic, the genes for it, and we saw this a lot the last couple of years. Like, I think when we were talking on the recording a little over a year ago, right after you got out from hospital. You were talking about how QAnon situation helped propel you down that rabbit hole and realize your bipolar situation. A lot of people may be in that same position, and where they may be getting close, especially in the last couple of years, to realizing on some level that they are manic, and instead of going down that rabbit hole blind and unknowing, sort of like you were, it may give them some shed some light on their situation. So I think
definitely it will help people to diagnose themselves or diagnose family members if they read it.
Yeah, we'll diagnose, but also just like I said, there's probably billions of stories similar to this, but almost none of them go told, at least on a wide available level like this. And even if they do, they're a very fictionalized version of it at best, for the most part. So now, and I think the other thing it's sort of helpful along those lines too is that since that's the case, people who haven't gone through it yet, or and it happens more often this way with men. So women, maybe they'll go through it, but differently. Sometimes they're less understanding, and of course, people who are younger, so they haven't gone through that, they're less understanding. But this kind of story should help people, even if they're not going to go through it. It should help people have a better understanding of this idea of the midlife transition crisis, dark night of the soul situation.
Right.
Is that part of what you're trying to accomplish too?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm trying to wake people up essentially to the shadow, but it's very, very difficult because people deny their shadow. So as soon as you talk about it, it kind of disappears because they don't acknowledge it. But the way I did it was to draw them into a story which maybe they should feel like they shouldn't be reading, but they're seduced, so they feel that they keep on going. They maybe feel pity for me, but they don't want to stop reading. And that's kind of their shadow speaking, that they want to read it at all costs.
Right. Yeah.
Although they can cope with it because it's written in a reasonably light-hearted tone, or it's well written, I guess. But I've noticed that people with particularly strong shadows, that really obvious shadows, have a difficulty reading it.
Maybe that's my problem.
Do you find it difficult to read?
Oh,
I don't know, lots of other things to do.
It's like I was saying earlier, it just becomes kind of heavy to think about, because the way that I sort of
well, you're a heavy thinker, so I'm not surprised by that.
Well, right, because normally if I read something not so true to life, then I can kind of just think like, okay, that's interesting what the author tried to do with this work, whether it was in any type of book, especially fiction. Then I can just think of like, oh, why they do this sort of literary device and this type of storytelling and not that. But if it's real life, then it's just like it's heavier to think about, because in a fictionalized version, or even if it's nonfiction, but just like about those kind of things, like about people that go through these kind of situations, then you can just kind of think like, oh, this and that. But it's sort of uniquely humanized in that way. And that
thank you. I take that as a compliment.
Yeah, well, it is, and it's that it just makes it heavier, especially when you get into those parts of it where it's like, and especially too because like I said, I mm, I've thought a lot about these things, especially the last couple of years of what this process is like, and why that it's so hard um to verbalize, and
Yeah.
I guess that I could relate with it, and I think that's the tricky part too is, yeah, sure, some shadow things going on, but also for some people it's going to be very relatable who go through um divorce and go through those kind of transitions in midlife, and go through getting into new relationships, and uh, all those things that are a unique challenge in the midlife, and um, often underappreciated as such.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's just very, very personal, I think, for the reader connecting with the author and just in general, which makes it it's own strange enigma, because you're just looking at life rather than like a created thing, because there's no, because okay, the thing in literature normally is there's that sort of ex machina moment where it's like the author can just write himself out of any situation.
Yeah, right. Of course.
whereas
Fuck out of it.
whereas with real life, it's like there's real consequences, and the person's mental health is constantly at stake, and so is that of the other people involved, the children and everything else. So it
Yeah,
makes it
yeah.
uniquely high stakes, I guess. But is that also what made it hard to write too, is that?
Oh, really hard to write. I
Yeah.
struggled with how to write. I had to
Mm,
write my ex-wife into the story.
mm,
Um, as my, as herself, but I didn't want to be too hard on her.
yeah.
And then all the other characters, but mainly myself. Actually, I find it hard. I found it hard to write certain things when I had to go into the Jonah to the belly of the whale. It was a long process and that took about 2 years to do. So you'll see
What?
later. There's some light-hearted stuff. There's some
Yeah.
Tinder dates and stuff like this.
Well, what was that like? Because I think that would be what I'd be mainly afraid of, is getting other people involved, and uh, what that they would think about being involved in the story. So what was that like in terms of sort of getting permission from your now ex-wife and
She
girlfriend
hasn't
at the
read it.
time?
She read an early version and she said it was hard. Was it disaster tourism
Disaster
and
tourism, interesting.
and soft porn fantasy
Interesting.
is what she remembered, mostly the sexy parts,
The sexy parts, wow.
and she didn't like it. She didn't like that. But I mean, I would have. Soft porn fantasy is completely
Mm,
not what it's about. But
yeah,
some
girls, they get into that stuff, the sexy
right,
novels. um
right, and then Eva, I had to share it with her, and she was like, "I thought I had a bit part in this, but you mentioned me 274 times, and what is this?" But then I sat down with her, and she went along with it.
wow,
Yeah,
that's pretty big there, that they
yeah, right.
yeah. I mean, that's, I think, what I would be most afraid of, is like how to represent other people that is honest, but at the same time doesn't make them look too bad, because that's what's tough compared to fiction. In fiction, you can do whatever you want with the characters because they're
Right.
not real. uh but yeah, that would be one of the toughest parts for me, but I'm
It was
I'm pretty,
tough. It was
yeah.
tough. I had to. I have to confront whether I wanted to write it, and then is there another way to write it? But the trouble was that always the real events were much more, maybe I'm not that creative, but much more real than anything I could come up with.
Interesting.
Like the incident with the in the chapter 2 with the taxi, when we tried to hail a taxi, and then my wife stormed off and said, "You didn't even order a taxi." But there was a traffic jam, so the taxi couldn't get through.
Yeah,
that was exactly how it happened. And yeah, I mean, I could have written another story, but that was what happened that night.
Another interesting aspect that it just surprises me every time, but it kind of reminds me of what became popular the last 20 years in television, is what they call breaking the fourth wall, where they'll talk directly to the camera. And you
Oh, right.
have
I didn't know what that was.
well, you have a version of that, which is basically there's at least a few times where you're like, my editor says this.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
I think normally people would just maybe imply it without giving that so directly. But how did you decide to go with your own maybe version of breaking the fourth wall in your writing?
Well, the first chapter seemed like so synchronistic that I went straight ahead and wrote it as it happened, or in the weeks afterwards. I don't know when.
Yeah.
And I decided at that point that I wanted to, as we already mentioned, that I wanted to write a book from that first chapter, because it was so synchronistic. The events were so seemed like so powerful. Obviously, they were amplified by my bipolar disorder, that I had to write them down. And the first chapter, the way we met in the bar, that I asked for my coat from this guy, and then she came up behind me and said she wants her coat too. And then the guy turned around to us and said, "Are you two going home together?" And I said, "Yeah, let's go home together." And then she said, "Let's smoke a cigarette first." And that's how it actually happened.
Yeah, that does sound almost like something that would be written into a sitcom, but it really happened that way.
Right.
But I think there was another part, I don't know, a few chapters later, when you were saying something like about you were having trouble verbalizing things or giving detail at certain points because you said your editor wanted more detail here.
Right.
And you're like, well, this is the best I can do. But how did you decide to sort of include the editor in a way into the book?
Because he left comments in the book which were valid comments, but I didn't know what to do with them. And I thought it would be a good idea to break the fourth wall and remind readers that this is a true story, and that there are bits that are left out and that I can't deal with.
Okay. Yeah. Talk to the reader in a more personal way, I guess, in a more, remember, this is a book and this is real life. And that's interesting. I've never really seen that before, but who knows? Maybe it'll catch on now. We'll call it the
well, it might
courage.
be my one of my the courage device.
Yeah.
one of my I forgot what I was going to say. One of my goals was to get other people to write their own stories in a similar way, because it's just a really powerful experience. I think you know that Jordan Peterson has his self-authoring program. Where, have you heard of that?
Yeah, I've used it. I haven't gone into a lot of details there. Did you ever do your
No, I never tried it. No,
okay.
I never tried it.
It's interesting. It gives you a lot of prompts, like break your life into these 7 or so epochs, and then why is this important? Why is this important? So it like gives you in a very coherent way a structure to build your little autobiography.
Yeah,
So it's interesting. And
but
like I
there's
was saying
definitely value
earlier,
to
yeah.
that.
Yeah, because like I was saying earlier, I don't know, maybe healing isn't the word, maybe just not the best word, but how would you describe it in terms of whether you call it the power, the healing, the feeling, uh, the advantage, like what comes from this process in terms of your own self
Hmm.
growth or maturation? What would you call that or describe that as?
From my own perspective,
Mhm.
I've read a lot and I discussed a lot of things with a lot of people
Yeah.
along the way, and that really helped. That was really my process of maturation. Writing it down was uh, kind of that, but not. That was almost the easy part.
Mhm.
uh, Putting it all together into a coherent narrative was again a tough part, which I had to do for the benefit of the reader, right? So
Mhm.
the reader has to understand the narrative.
But
Whereas,
what do you like? What like do you ever like sometimes when I go through a difficult thing, I kind of like and I'm like, okay, this is me now accomplishing this difficult thing.
yeah,
And imagine myself if I didn't do so. Like, do you ever like say, how would I be if I didn't face this difficult task and do it? Um, what is it that could, especially if one of your goals is to try to encourage people to do the same thing, what is it most that you feel like you've gotten out of it at this point?
uh, I got out of writing the book.
Yeah, in terms of
Uh,
like your own self, whether you want to call that healing, empowerment, or any other feeling,
well, I
or
really love to read the feedback from people and hear what they think. For my, and I feel like it was, I feel like it's a very unique book
mm,
because I haven't come across anything like it before. There's obviously memoirs written all the time,
mm,
but I don't know if they go quite as extreme as I did. So
yeah.
it feels good to be a pioneer on the front line in a way. That's
Yeah,
how I feel.
the courage pioneer of writing out your midlife crisis as you go through it.
Well, yeah,
That's what they'll call the
kind of,
genre someday.
yeah, kind of sensing it, but without knowing it, sensing the bipolar disorder in particular,
Hmm.
without knowing it. So I was going through something without knowing it, or approaching
Mm,
some great denouement without knowing it. Uh, I've spoken to a lot of people who have
mhm,
bipolar disorder
mhm.
since. This is my new thing.
Your new thing is to chat with
Yeah,
bipolar people.
yeah, and they really don't know what's going on,
Mm,
and they how they could end up with a psychosis. That's not it's not obvious to them. Whereas to me, it was kind of obvious that I would end up. You'll have to read it to see, but
okay. Hmm. So,
so I was on a definite flight path the whole time.
mhm,
And how did that feel, or how does that feel?
yeah.
Feels good to have come to the end of it, basically.
Okay.
Although I'm still struggling with the side effects of the medication, so I never get up at 9 in the morning like I did today.
Oh, sorry, I forced you to do that.
No, that's all right. That's all right. I
um,
normally get up around this time, like 10:30.
okay.
Whenever I go to bed, like last night, I forced myself to go to bed at 8 o'clock, and that seemed to work.
Okay. Um, Interesting. So I think, like, as we anticipate the sequel, everybody's gonna want to know at this point if they've read the book or just interested in it. Like, anything you can tell us now about where you're at with your condition, your medication, your life, anything you can get into about where things
Well,
are at now?
I'm
What?
on lithium.
Okay.
Lithium, 750 milligrams a day. I'm
Mm,
also taking olanzapine. These drugs all have different brand names, so people might not know.
yeah.
Or so I'm on 15 milligrams of that, and another one, Lamactil, I'm on 25 milligrams, I think. So that's my medical stuff that's going on, but that makes me tired as hell during the day, so I can't really do very much. So I'm kind of treading water a little bit, waiting to get over this phase in my life, which is recovery from bipolar, even though it's been a year and a half now.
Mm.
But hopefully my doctor's going to switch out one of the meds and that will help. I'm still single.
Okay, back on the
That's
market.
that's
Rawr,
another
watch out.
question.
Okay. Okay,
But
ladies.
it's hard to date when you go to bed at 9 o'clock and get up at 11. No, 10. Well, don't go to bed at 9, but yeah, that's problematic.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to promote the book as much as I can at the moment, which is
a good thing to
difficult
do.
because I don't want to I have to give the game away with the bipolar. Spoiler alert.
Well, but yeah, I think that's almost like a trailer, like a trailer preview. Like,
Right.
you're
Yeah.
not given all the breadcrumbs at once. You're not given a whole loaf of bread. You're just given
Loaf of bread.
you're just given the breadcrumbs to lead people along and know that it's going somewhere interesting. Uh, Especially to get through some of the chapters that seem very or can seem a little bit like the, standard, oh, another midlife crisis.
Yeah.
But it gives something to hope for when you're like, ooh, what's it like to go through bipolar disorder? Ooh, what's it like to be manic?
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting about doing it the way that it's done, um is we're going through the journey just as you went through it. Because, like, early on we don't exactly know that, other than some of the hints and maybe soft spoilers that they might get through a conversation like this.
Yeah.
uh you might sense it, but we're a little bit oblivious, just like you were. And then it's it's slowly let out, like, what's going on. But
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, I do mention the first line
yeah.
that how I ended up in hospital. This is the story of how I ended up in hospital, or something like this. It starts with. So I don't try and hide it, but people tend to ignore these things.
Yeah,
In my
it's like
experience,
they just get kind of sucked into the moment of, okay, here's another midlife crisis, okay, a divorce. Like,
exactly.
interesting. Yeah. And then the moment
It
kind
is
of thing.
interesting how readers respond. That's really fascinating to me.
Well, what has that been? What has that response been like? Because you mentioned that a couple times. What kind of response have you been getting? The interesting response from
You can
readers?
read the responses on Amazon,
Okay.
but people are like, I couldn't put it down. It
Hmm.
was a really fast read. It's really well written, but people don't really go into the female orgasm and whatever else I experienced.
Oh yeah. That's one thing that I was uh you know what's a book that you would like that kind of reminds me of your female orgasm situation is I think it's called Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey.
Mm-hmm.
He in his book there's a couple moments that are similar to your book or remind me of them. Um, although for the most part, it's his whole autobiography of like 50 years or whatever. But he had a couple wet dreams, and
Yeah.
which he normally didn't, but he had like two in his life, but they were like religious experience types. And then what's interesting about him going through that situation compared to a normal person is like in one, he was in the Amazon. So he's like, okay, I got to go to the real Amazon. And he had
So he
this like,
decided to go there.
yeah, he
to
went
some-
like a pilgrimage into the Amazon. And then another one was similar, but it was like somewhere in Africa. So he went to Africa. Yeah, that there's some parts like that that remind me of your little
All
case
right, that
history.
sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah. So, yeah. And anything else in terms of how people can find you and find your book and everything, and then we should probably wrap it up before we give too much else away.
Right. Well, there's a website called mandulathebook.com.
Okay.
Mandula.
Okay.
What else? I still kept my old Twitter and Instagram handles, which is Dr. Donzo.
Dr. Donzo. Okay.
Yeah. And that's it really. I'm on the Daily Archetype.
All right. Yeah.
Happy to
Okay.
get
Yeah.
on
So I'll link all that, and
Oh, and
then
sorry,
yeah.
what I should have mentioned is that search for my name, Adrian Courage, on all your favorite, on your favorite, or wherever you get your not podcasts, wherever you get your ebooks.
Ebooks. So not
You'll find me.
not only Kindle, but other
Yeah,
other things.
Kobo, Google Books, Apple
Okay.
Books.
All
They're the
those,
main
okay.
ones.
Okay.
So whichever platform you use
For
use that.
ebooks.
But if you have an iPad, I would suggest you use Google Books. I mean Apple Books.
Oh, okay.
I get more money that way.
Oh,
The
okay.
price is the same.
Okay.
Amazon take a big cut.
They take a bigger cut. Okay.
Yeah.
So Apple
They all
Books,
take a
but
big cut, but Amazon takes the biggest.
interesting. Yeah. Now I wish I would have known that, not just for you, but I had to use my Kindle, which I normally don't use a lot. But although I don't know if Apple will do it on my iPhone, but sometimes I'll have the Kindle read it to me.
Yeah,
But
that's cool.
it won't do so if I use Kindle on my iPhone, but I don't know if it'll do it if I use Apple Books. Anyway, I'll figure it out. But
Yeah.
cool.
So yeah,
All right.
search for my name on whichever platform you use. And,
all right. Apple Books for the Apple users and other stuff for other people.
Google Play Books, I think it's called, or Google Books.
Okay.
You might have to download a separate app for that.
Okay. Is
I don't know.
there going to be a print version that we can look forward to for you signing and sending out to people or anything like that?
Yeah. If I sell a certain number, which I haven't decided yet,
okay,
then I will do a print version, and people who've bought it will get a signed copy.
Oh wow.
Loyal readers.
Loyal readers. Wow. What an honor. It's that's exciting.
But I need more people to read it that I don't know, because at the moment I'm just writing to people on Messenger and saying, hey, my book's out, have you read it? Or
okay.
please read it. And they're like, yeah, whatever, dude.
Whatever, dude. Sure.
Some of them are. It's always surprising who buys it straight away. Some people say, yeah, I'll buy it, and they buy it.
Interesting. All right.
Interesting.
Adrian Courage. I think we'll do this again maybe in June, and then by that time I can get through the whole book. And yeah, so stay tuned, everybody, and we'll dig more into the creative process at that point. So thanks a lot, Adrian.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care.